Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials, NATO analysts, and intelligence observers had feared, tracked, and quietly prepared for. A development that unfolded not over weeks, not over days, but in a single overnight window, hours that reshaped strategic calculations, hours that raised nuclear tensions, hours that triggered one of the fastest military aid responses of this war. What Vladimir Putin did overnight crossed a line that Washington and its allies had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the United States did not hesitate. They responded with speed, scale, and strategic intent. For months now, there had been signals, not formal announcements, not televised speeches, but subtle signals that the Kremlin was preparing something unusual. Man, Russia has been aggressive, yes, but it has also been methodical in its aggression. Its moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a script: escalate, pause, threaten, wait for reaction. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this week was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian strategic behavior know the indicators. The sudden halt in routine military messaging, the absence of familiar spokespersons, the quiet movement of assets normally discussed loudly, and most telling of all the disappearance of denial, all of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it usually means something is about to get loud. Early morning hours, U.S. intelligence agencies detected what they described as unusual strategic signaling activity, including movements tied to Russia's nuclear command infrastructure that had not been publicly visible in over a year. Mullen, these are the kinds of assets Moscow only activates when it is signaling something very specific, deterrence, escalation, or pressure. The observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, balliandius. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its posture. And when a nuclear-armed state shifts posture without explanation, even slightly, every major capital pays attention. Manned, this wasn't a launch, it wasn't an exercise announcement, it was something more ambiguous and therefore more dangerous. The warning issued by U.S. officials tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic. It was urgent. Mensers, briefed after high-level emergency meetings, described Russia's move as, destabilizing, deliberately ambiguous, and most importantly, designed to force hesitation. But that strategy only works if the target hesitates, and the United States did not. In fact, today's response was among the fastest and most consequential of the entire war. Within hours of the intelligence confirmation, Washington authorized a shock military aid package for Ukraine. These were not routine supplies, but these were high-impact systems the U.S. typically deploys only when preparing to counter escalation, not weeks from now, but immediately. Tonight, Pentagon officials confirmed that the United States accelerated delivery of advanced defensive and strike support capabilities to Ukraine, including assets analysts believe were intended to counter strategic intimidation. The response came before Russia could leverage its signaling politically. They moved first, they targeted vulnerability, not territory. And they focused on command resilience, air defense, and battlefield survivability. In other words, Washington targeted the mechanisms that would make escalation effective. This is what made the warning so urgent. Russia's move wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. and left unanswered, it could have reshaped the psychological balance of the war. Instead, it was met with controlled force. Not recklessness, not panic, but strategy. Here's where the story becomes even more revealing. Analysts now believe Putin's move was designed to test Western resolve at a moment of political strain and global distraction. The Kremlin wanted to see whether Washington would slow down, hesitate, or soften its support. Instead, the opposite happened. The response was so rapid, so coordinated, that even Moscow noticed, you don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Washington did. Senior analysts describe this as counter-deterrence, not matching threat with threat, but removing the leverage behind the threat. That matters because it shows the US is not reacting emotionally, it is shaping the environment. As reports continued throughout the day, the scale became clearer. Filish US logistics teams activated prepositioned supply routes. Allied partners quietly synchronized deliveries. Ukrainian forces received capabilities aimed at denying escalation advantage. This wasn't just aid. This wasn't just messaging. This was strategic insulation. And insulation is exactly what Moscow has struggled to overcome since the early stages of the war. Every time Russia attempts pressure, Ukraine, backed by the West, counters with adaptation. Remember, Moscow believed, the West would fracture, support would slow. Manned escalation threats would intimidate, but tonight the opposite is happening. Support is faster, coordination is tighter, resolve is clearer. Bandy history matters here because every previous attempt at nuclear signaling has produced the same result, a greater unity against it. What makes this moment so significant and so risky is that it comes at a time when Putin faces mounting pressure, homeland domestic expectations, military strain, economic limits, and political timelines. Hardliners demand escalation, pragmatists warn of consequences. Military planners seek leverage. Moves made under this kind of pressure, there are rarely signs of confidence. They are signs of constraint. Washington's statement, now echoed by allies, made one thing clear. The United States is not willing to allow nuclear signaling to reshape the battlefield. AMDA officials described Russia's actions as inconsistent with strategic stability. That's diplomatic language for, this will not work. Meanwhile, Ukraine's leadership addressed the nation in a calm, resolute address. They spoke of resilience, of partnership, of readiness. Not panic, not fear, a signal in itself. Russia's move did not happen in isolation. Mendes alongside it, Farch increased rhetoric, Farch cyber probing, Farch regional military activity, all within the same time frame. End. When multiple pieces move together, it signals coordination, but coordination does not guarantee success. Analysts see several possibilities, a bluff, a probe, or an attempt to regain psychological initiative. But today, Washington removed that initiative. Demands no delay, no hesitation, no ambiguity. This is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see hesitation. Ukraine wants to show endurance. The US wants to prevent escalation. NATO wants stability. So far, the message is clear. Sources say monitoring continues. They say movements have slowed. They say rhetoric has softened, and they say the aid delivery changed calculations. That was the point. And as the days ahead unfold, we'll learn more about what Moscow hoped to achieve. But we already know this. The response was timely. It reinforced deterrence. It protected stability. What happens next depends on Moscow's next move. Tonight, for the first time in days, the Kremlin is quiet. bland, too quiet. And when Moscow is quiet, it's thinking, MLN, because tonight it learned something it has learned before, you know. Threats don't win wars. Pressure doesn't break resolve, and escalation cuts both ways. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is clear. The balance held, the line held, and the response was ready. We'll be watching every step of what comes next.